Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Pappas. I'm the Director of Transportation Resilience and Sustainability at the Department of Transportation. We have people still coming in, so we'll give about another minute or so for folks to get in, and we'll go ahead and get started with our program. Okay, looks like it's kind of leveled out as far as the participants. So again, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for spending a little bit of time with us this evening. We're very excited to talk about the EV implementation plan that we have here for the state of Delaware. Go to the next slide, please. So this is our first public meeting. We anticipate having more, and we're looking forward to this to get some input from the public to kind of let you know what we've been doing, we collectively as the team, and also to let the public know and to get input from the public as well. So this is our first meeting. It is being recorded. So if you want to go back and check it out, or if you have friends that maybe weren't able to join tonight's discussion, you'll be able to point them to our website where this recording will be. Next slide, please. So first thing we want to do is some introductions of the team that you'll be hearing from tonight. So again, my name was Jim Pappas from the Department of Transportation. Joining me from DelDOT is Stephanie Johnson, who is our Assistant Director. Susan, you want to introduce your team from DNREC?
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Love. I'm the Administrator of the Climate and Sustainability section in DNREC, but more importantly, Brianne is Brianne.
I am Brianne Prisen. I am the Clean Transportation Planner with the Delaware Division of Climate, Coastal, and Energy.
Great, thank you. So this has been a cooperative agreement between DelDOT, DNREC, and our consulting partners from AECOM. Joe?
Hi, my name is Joe Hofstee. As Jim mentioned, we're the consultant partners on this. I'm the project manager. I have with me Marge Quinn and Brendan Connolly.
Okay, great. So this is the team from the state of Delaware that has been working on this plan and that you'll hear from tonight, and also for future discussion. So we really appreciate the opportunity to work with both DNREC and AECOM. Greatly appreciate all the work that's been done to get us to this point, and we're excited to have this discussion to let you know kind of where we've been and kind of where we're going. So with that, so here's our agenda for this evening. So we'll talk about our expectations, a little bit of the background about the plan that has been developed at this point, talk about what our future visions and goals are, give you an idea of, what's the infrastructure look like today out there in Delaware. AECOM will go over some analysis that they have done. And then, again, with tonight is letting you know what the steps are that you can be involved as we move forward. And then at the end, we're going to open it up for any questions that you may have to us. So next slide, I think. And I think I'm kicking this off to you, Joe.
It's actually going to go to Marge Quinn. Marge?
Oops, I'm sorry.
Good evening. So I wanted to explain a little bit about what our expectations are for the meeting tonight. As has been mentioned by Jim, this is our first public meeting and there will be more to follow. So why are we here tonight? We're trying to kick off the planning process with members of the public and actually start the public engagement and have conversations about issues associated with electric vehicle infrastructure, i.e. charging locations. So how can you provide comment or ask questions about the plan? For tonight, you can use Zoom's Q&A function that's down at the bottom of your screen anytime during the presentation and during the question and answer period that we're going to have after we go through the presentation slides. And you can use that Q&A function to offer comments or to ask a question of the team. At any time, you can fill out a comment form that's that can be accessed through the plan's website. And here is our plan's web address. And anytime you can also send an email to ev@delaware.gov to send a suggestion or a comment or ask a question. Next slide. So in addition to working and starting dialogue with the general public, we also have an advisory group that's been assisting in the plan development process and understanding some key issues that the state is facing. We're working with a group of over 20 different organizations, ranging from transportation organizations to electric utility corporations, as well as community organizations and environmental groups. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Brianne.
Hi, Bree, you're on mute.
Thank you. All right, starting again. So we're going to go ahead and kick this off by giving a little bit of a background about why we're doing this, why we're putting together this EV infrastructure plan, why it's important, and just kind of give a little bit of basics on electric vehicles, just in case those on the call are not quite fully familiar with the technology out there. So next slide, please. So Delaware's Climate Action Plan was released in November 2021, and it is intended to guide the state's efforts in minimizing greenhouse gas emissions and maximizing our resiliency to climate change impacts. So the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is from the transportation sector, particularly from light-duty passenger vehicles. So over the last several decades, we have certainly learned to rely on our cars to get from point A and point B. And emissions coming from those tailpipes of our cars contain a full suite of pollutants that are not only the largest contributors to the effects of climate change, but also has a profound negative effect on our air quality and our human health, particularly our disproportionately impacted communities that are near pollution sources, such as highways, ports, and power plants. So in areas with more traffic, we'll certainly see greater effects with higher numbers of affected people. And there tend to be higher hospitalization rates in our younger and older populations. And children will miss more school from illnesses such as asthma. And because of this, they will fall behind or tend to fall behind academically. So there's sometimes a correlation in those areas with lower graduation rates. So in the state's Climate Action Plan, one strategy is to minimize greenhouse gas emissions, is to transition to zero emission vehicles and more efficient transportation systems. So in order to transition to a zero emission vehicle, such as electric vehicles, because that's what our technology is right now, there needs to be infrastructure in place to help with that transition. Next slide, please. So the availability of charging stations is certainly a critical factor in electric vehicle adoption, and having a comprehensive charging network, including home and public, charging ensures that electric vehicles are as convenient as conventional vehicles and increases drivers' confidence. To help guide the transition, we need to get an understanding of the landscape and where EV charging stations could go. And this EV charging station infrastructure plan will certainly inform us on how to expand the charging network, strengthen consumer adoptions of EVs, and also help us with ensure grid stability and stimulate the economy with job creation and workforce development and training. The plan will be a living document and will be updated as the landscape changes, which is pretty often right now. So it is certainly intended to kind of forecast things now, and we will continuously revisit the plan to ensure that we are on the right track. So next slide, please. Another strategy in the Climate Action Plan is to have 17,000 new EV sales sold by each year by 2030. And so that number was had come out of the modeling that was done for our Climate Action Plan to achieve our emission reduction goals. And one of the ways to achieve that is by adopting the Advanced Clean Cars 2 vehicle emission standards, which will require 100% of new vehicle sales to be zero emission vehicles by 2035. Several manufacturers have already declared that they will be all electric over the next 15 to 20 years, with more manufacturers making that declaration as we get further into the transition. Next slide, please. So I don't want to assume that everyone on the call knows all the different technologies, as I said earlier. So I do want to kind of quickly cover the basics. So a full battery electric vehicle is just that. It is all electric. There is no gas, there's no engine, there's no thousands of moving parts to break. And they have low maintenance costs. They're super fun to drive. They're practical, and drivers can save a lot of money using an electric vehicle. And then we've got two different types of hybrids. We've got our plug-in hybrid version, and then we have the conventional or regular hybrid, if you will. Both of those do run on gas and battery, with both have a high amount of fuel efficiency on the gas side, but plug-in versions do have larger batteries and are plugged into a wall like a regular electric vehicle. And the vehicle can run solely on electric first before it kicks into gas or kicks over to gas. With conventional hybrids, the vehicle kind of chooses when it'll use the electric motor, which is much smaller, and that is charged through just regenerative braking, not by plugging in like a plug-in hybrid. So I will have a link put into the chat, and that link is going to send you a list of all of the plug-in hybrid and battery electric vehicles available on the market today. Without the super luxury models, but these are the ones that are just a little bit more affordable. And this list will give prices, it'll give the current federal tax credits, it'll give safety ratings, charging rates, and really anything else that you didn't think that you needed to know. It is all there for you. So we'll have that dropped in the chat. You can check that list out. Next slide, please. So in terms of how to charge EVs, there are 3 levels. You've got 1, 2, and DC fast charging. Or level 3, it's not often referred to that as that though. But level 1 is on your typical 110 volt household outlet. It's a good option for smaller batteries like plug-in hybrids, but for a full battery electric with a larger battery, it's certainly not practical, as it can take a couple of days to fully charge a depleted battery. So level 2 chargers are on a 208 or 240 volt, depending on its use. So it's kind of like having an additional household appliance at your house, essentially installed there. So this is more a practical option for at home or work charging, and during a work day or overnight charging can provide drivers with a fuel tank of fuel, if you will, to go about their business. So there's no more cold mornings at the gas stations that you get to stand there and fuel up. So for those who do need a quick charge for like traveling, or if they've got to charge at home or at work, DC fast charging stations are a much quicker option to get the charge that they need. Next slide, please. All right, so what is the state's role in electric vehicle charging stations? So our role is to provide funding through different programs, such as various grant opportunities and DNREC's rebate program that we have for charging stations. Our role is to also help establish contracting mechanisms and to help identify areas where policies and regulations may be needed or changed in order to accelerate or standardize the infrastructure to help accelerate adoption as well. So though there are a few state-owned level 2 stations at some of the state-owned facilities trickled throughout the state of Delaware does not necessarily plan on owning and operating DC fast charging stations, and that the few that are in the state are privately owned and operated. So any funding opportunities that do come out will be done through a competitive grant process. So I'm going to go ahead and kick this back over to AECom, who will talk about the plan itself. Joe?
Thanks, Bree. So what is an EV infrastructure plan? I'm going to spend a little time going over that. So what is the EV infrastructure plan? The main goal of the EV infrastructure plan is to identify the future EV charging needs of Delaware. And this isn't the specific location of an individual EV charger, but overall state where we need to focus on placing new EV chargers and make sure the infrastructure is in place so it can succeed. The plan, we want to make sure we pay special focus to the disadvantaged communities, the rural areas, and then the residents of multi-unit dwellings. These are areas that could be left behind, and we want to make sure that they have equal opportunity to access charging stations and utilize the EV vehicles. We also want to make sure it incorporates the following items: the existing background condition data, and then preparing future forecasts for EV charging needs and usage. Engaging the stakeholders and the public, which we're currently doing and will continue to do with the next upcoming workshops. And then also to make recommendations for EV infrastructure priority areas. This is the main sections that we're looking to include in the EV infrastructure plan. In this areas, we're looking to get comments back on. The main areas we're looking at is the plan, vision, and goals, which I'll go through in the next couple slides. Also, the public involvement and stakeholder engagement to make sure that we're reaching out to everyone that we can possibly to get feedback on the plan and then to let people know what the plan is. It's also going to look at existing future condition analysis, both the Delaware EV market analysis and then the charging demand analysis. And then it's also going to show what the findings are of the studies. We're going to deploy the infrastructure to build for the future. We're going to look at any existing policy barriers that may get in the way of implementation of the EV plans and see if there's ways to get around to modify those policies. We're also going to look at workforce development needs. That's a key component of this to make sure that we have the people out there who can maintain and build these new EV charging stations and continue to make sure they're operational, which is a new skill set. We want to make sure people have that skill set. People coming out of college or trade schools, and also the existing workforce. We also want to make sure we identify the funding sources that are available. There's many different funding sources out there, and we want to make sure that Delaware has access to those funding sources. And then we also want to focus on resiliency and sustainability. We want to make sure that these EV chargers are out there, are properly functioning so that when people go to use them, they know they can use them and they're there to be used. Next, I'm going to get into the draft plan vision. So what we currently have for the draft plan vision is enable current and future users of electric vehicles to confidently travel in and across Delaware for work, education, recreation, and exploration. The key to that is confidently travel the state. We want to make sure that it's a reliable system that people can use and trust as much as pulling into a gas station. We do want feedback and suggestions. As part of this comment forms, please do provide feedback on the plan vision that we have laid out here. The next thing is the draft plan goal areas. And this is another section we really would like some feedback and suggestion on. The first one is equity. We want to make sure that the rural, underserved, and disadvantaged communities are not left behind, that they are continue to be engaged and realize part of the plan and they can benefit from the plan and EV vehicles. We're looking for reliability. We want to develop a reliable, convenient, affordable, and equitable EV infrastructure network in Delaware for all users. And then connections. We want to connect the Delawareans and travelers in Delaware to EV chargers to support an electric transportation future. And then education, as I mentioned previously, we want to develop outreach material on electric vehicles, good charging habits, station locations, station usage. We want to make sure people are aware of the EV chargers and how to use them and where they are, and also to educate the workforce on them. We also have evaluation. We want to develop a framework to collect data and evaluate the plan over time. As Bree mentioned, this plan is a living document, and we want to make sure it continues to change over time and keeps up with the current environment that we're living in. I'm now going to turn it over to Brendan Connolly to go over existing conditions.
Thanks, Joe. We can go on to the next slide. So based on data from the Alternative Fuel Center, there's 25 existing installed DC fast charger locations that hold a total of 97 ports. Ports are sort of like a connector piece. So at a single location, there might be numerous ports there. And then there's 108 level 2 charging locations for a total of 229 ports. And you can see where those charging locations are shown in the map on the left. We'll be providing a close-up on each of the counties in the following slides, but you'll notice kind of an overall trend here is that charging stations are predominantly along major highway corridors in the state and also in the northern part of the state with some of the more rural in southern parts of the state lacking infrastructure. So the goal of this plan is to really address where those gaps exist and where charging stations should be prioritized in the future. Next slide. So for each of the county maps, we'll provide a little bit more detail on each of the chargers. We note which charging stations are Tesla stations and the capacity levels of DC fast chargers. We'll really dive into why that's somewhat relevant in one of the coming up slides, but just provide a little bit more granularity on the previous map. Looking closer at Newcastle County specifically, there's a concentration of chargers in Newark and Wilmington along I-95. Next slide. We'll give you a little bit of time here to also just digest the maps, but in Kent County, chargers are mainly located along US 13 and Delaware 1, close to Dover, with some of the eastern and western areas outside of that corridor lacking infrastructure. Next slide. And then finally, Sussex County continues the trend, really being sited along these major highway corridors, but then also numerous chargers being sited along the beach towns on the southeast side. Next slide. And so the federal government has designations for specific routes that they want to be prioritized to install EV charging infrastructure on. And these are known as alternative fuel corridors, or AFCs. You notice that the 5 routes that the state of Delaware has designated listed there. So I-95, I-295, Delaware 1, US 13, and then US 113. And there's a substantial amount of funding available to install DC fast chargers along these routes through another federal program known as the NEVI program, which is currently in progress in a parallel initiative as this. Going back to why we added a little bit more details in the maps above, is that the NEVI program requires very specific charger specifications. So we had those included. Again, this project is really aiming at providing charging outside of those corridors and creating a cohesive network throughout the state. Next slide. And so now we'll be moving on to some of our modeling and analysis conducted to assess charging demand and priority areas for charging that future chargers should be sited at. So I would note that these are preliminary results at this time, and we're really looking for feedback from the public prior to presenting our final results at the next workshop. Next slide. First, to assess charging demand throughout the future, we've developed 4 different growth scenarios for EVs in the state. The scenarios are really meant to assess the impact of costs, model availability, charging infrastructure, and policies on EV adoption throughout 2040. Obviously, a lot of the environment is changing very rapidly, both from technology front, but then also world events. We've been hearing a lot about supply chain shortages and the impacts of gasoline prices on EV adoption. So this is really meant to serve as an order of magnitude and identify kind of the needs that would be pursued to reach those levels of adoption. So based on our results, you can see that it's projected up to 32% of the passenger vehicle population could be zero emission by 2035. I would say really the main takeaway here is that the number of EVs on the roads is expected to grow significantly in the future, no matter what scenario is really forecasted out. And it requires an enhanced charging network and policies to support that demand. And really, especially to achieve the ambitious state targets, such as the one that Bree mentioned earlier, Clean Cars 2 initiative, to reach 100% ZEV sales in 2035. Next slide. We'll now dive into our methodology that we use to identify priority areas for future charging to support that projected EV adoption. We first identify areas using a data layer analysis, which is kind of cool, and we'll get into those details on the coming slides. But from here, we'll utilize those results to recommend a charger type. And then finally, we really want to validate these preliminary findings and our methodology with the public, which is what we're doing here today. Next slide. So to identify priority areas, we look at 4 different modules, and each module has criteria associated with it that we're pulling from publicly available sources. So EV charging network, we're looking at the existing level 2 and DC fast charging network as well as traffic data. For early EV adopters, we look at demographics that's been correlated to early EV adoption, income, education level, car ownership, housing status, things like that. The next module is land use, where we look at population density and multifamily housing. And then finally, equity with unemployment, social vulnerability metrics, pollution exposure, housing burden, and access to public transportation. And we'll dive into why we looked at these 4 different modules and kind of the significance of them in the coming slides. But each module and criteria can be weighted based on the priorities of both the state and local stakeholders. Next slide, please. So you'll see the preliminary results from our assessment. Again, we're looking for feedback on the methodology here and to revise it if necessary. So you'll be seeing the results of each module. This is the early EV adoption module. And on the right, you'll see how we weighted each module and the criteria. So the module is with the check mark on it, and then the shaded box is what would be selected for the criteria. In the map, the darker green areas reflect higher priority areas to site charging infrastructure. So for early EV adoption, we wanted to consider where charging infrastructure is needed and would be utilized by near-term early EV adoption. Based on this assessment, adoption is expected in the northern tip of the state, near Dover, and as well on the southern beach towns, which is sort of unsurprising because this is where existing charger exists today. And again, we're looking to expand this to other areas of the state. So that's the first module that we looked at. The next one is the EV charging network. And here we wanted to look at really have a high priority on filling in gaps to the existing network, but also along highly trafficked routes. So you'll see that scores are higher where charging stations don't exist currently and along some of those highly trafficked routes. Next slide, please. The land use module, we wanted to site chargers in population centers and where multifamily housing exists so it can reach as many end users as possible. So you'll see the darker colored green areas are population centers and where a lot of apartment buildings are sited in the state and represent higher priority based on our requirements. And then finally, the equity layer module, which we've set as a high priority as this is really a focus to site charging infrastructure in areas that are underserved to bring in equity. Underserved communities often lack charging infrastructure for EVs. And as we previously mentioned, they really face the disproportional impacts of pollution. So this is another layer in our methodology. And then finally, we just went over each of the 4 modules and kind of the prioritization that's been associated with each of them. We really want to take this to the next level and combine each of those modules into a total data layer, which will be used to identify priority areas. We're not really focused on specific sites at this moment and just want to note where is charging needed and where it should be placed. So those are the 4 modules. We're really looking for feedback on the progress and intended to share the results during our next meeting. And I'll pass it over to Jim.
Great. Thank you so much, Brendan. So as you've heard, there's a lot of information and a lot of work that's gone into this. And we greatly appreciate all the assistance that we've received from DNREC and our partners at AECOM. So our next steps, as you see here, is going forward. You've heard, where we've been and kind of where we're going. So again, input from the public is of great importance to us. The analysis and kind of getting to the point of determining locations of where these charging stations are going to be is next up. And then we have more meetings that will be forthcoming. So again, there are going to be more opportunities for us to hear from you, the public, of where you feel the infrastructure is needed as we move forward. Next slide, please. Okay. So these are ways that you can stay involved. So there's the website that has been propped up that not only is the information from tonight, but the recordings will be on this site as well. We've seen some emails and some chat, and we apologize for folks that weren't able to maybe get in right at the beginning. So apologies for that. 2 options that we have another session coming up at 6 o'clock that will be basically the same information, but also, as we've noted, this is being recorded, so we can you could share it with that respect as well. There's the information that's available on the website again for you to complete some commentary. Again, provide your information in that respect. And then, we want to hear from the public, so we will have future meetings. So please feel free to, be involved with those as we continue to move on. Next one. Okay. So as Marge referenced, if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and drop them in the Q&A, and we will be happy to answer as many questions as we possibly can. So please feel free to drop your question in there. So I guess, Marge, do we have some questions that are been sent to us?
Yes, we do. We have got a couple here. I don't understand the present situation where you put charging stations in the train station parking garage. Do you leave your car in the parking place for the charging all day long? Is there an attendant to move your car when charged? How does this work?
So I guess we'll start with that. So the general concept is similar to like the park and ride facilities that, you would park your physical vehicle there, you would plug your vehicle in, and when you return, your vehicle is charged up and you're ready to go. So there's not an intent for somebody, it's not like a valet situation where you drop your keys off to somebody and they're going to, move it at some point in time. So it's there when you leave, and it should be there when you return.
Okay, there's another question we have. Thinking about some low-hanging fruit about different locations, would possibly be locating stations at county and state parks, DNREC properties, wildlands properties, etc. Are these being thought about?
So
Sue,
I'm
you want to take that one?
Yeah, Bree and I can answer that one for sure. And the answer is absolutely yes. There are existing programs that we have that incentivize landowners at county and state parks. Thanks for the shout out for DNREC properties for destination charging. And you can access those programs at de.gov/clean transportation. So destinations are a wonderful place to put level 2 charging stations, not just state-owned property or county-owned property, but also businesses, shopping centers, etc. And our charging programs right now, I think, do a pretty good job of helping to incentivize the installation of those types of chargers. Right now, we're really looking at the need in each geographic area, and once we see that, if there are some great locations that are parks or something like that, we may go after those specifically. So we're looking at everything.
Okay,
Bree, did I get it all, Bree?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so we have another question. It's about charging locations. To what degree does the plan, or will the plan, consider vehicle to grid, meaning potential impact to charge at home at night when costs are low, feed the office during work, or a presumed shift to solar energy generation? The potential impact would be charging during the day may then, once solar power generation has increased, be cheaper and to be encouraged. So are those items that the plan is considering? Vehicle to grid and solar energy generation.
So the solar is certainly something that we want to take in consideration from a renewable standpoint. We actually had a discussion earlier today about that, about using solar and capturing the energy in some type of a microgrid. So we're in conversations with the University of Delaware right now because they have some expertise in that specific area. So that actually kind of ties in with the vehicle to grid. Again, we've been in conversations with the University of Delaware and some industry partners on that technology. So we're not going to kind of hone in specifically on that, but that is certainly some technology and innovation that's certainly going to be something that we'll look into in the future.
And just to add to that a little bit, you know, that this is our first planning opportunity statewide for EV infrastructure. And certainly as we identify the scope and scale of the transition that we're trying to make, that will help us address where we might need to go after more solar charging or where might be good opportunities for V2G, et cetera. So this is, you know, this is the opening chapter. It's not the end of the book for us as we make this transition.
Okay, so we have another question about funding sources. What funding sources are expected besides NEVI in the next 24 months?
So the NEVI funding is right now, so not to get too much into the details, but there's two types of funding that DelDOT is receiving. And the what's called formula funding, meaning is money that's guaranteed to DelDOT under the NEVI program. So we're going to get that in our bank account. There's also what are called discretionary grants that other people can go after, including DelDOT, DNREC, MPOs. That's a competitive situation where you basically submit a grant proposal and it will be reviewed by the federal government and they will kind of dole out, you know, according to what funding they have available and the merits of the project. So that's what's called discretionary. And right now we're not going after that because we have basically, again, this formula funding, which is guaranteed funding that will come to Delaware, and all states are getting it. And it's, you know, proportion based upon the size and lane miles and things like that. So right now, the funding that we have and that we are intending to use in the deployment is just the formula funding that we receive. But again, there's discretionary funding under this program, and there are several other programs under the president's latest federal legislation. There's what's called a carbon reduction plan that we could use it for, and there's also a program called Protect. So there's multiple funding sources, but for right now, we're focusing just on the NEVI funds.
And I'll also add that there are other funding sources beyond what Jim just mentioned as well, that are more on the energy side, energy efficiency side in both the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the recently passed IRA. And so as the state is looking at all of these opportunities, EV charging is often an allowable expense under those grants. And again, some of them are competitive, some of them are formula grants, like Jim said. So there are lots of opportunities, and as we move forward, we're going to be peeling the onion on that and trying to identify which opportunities are best suited for the needs that we have here in Delaware.
Okay, is DNREC planning on extending the rebates for EVs and EVSE?
Yes. Short answer is yes. We certainly intend to extend the program beyond its current deadline date of December 31st. Whether that's an extension of its current form, or it'll be some changes having to do with, you know, the market and price and tax credits and all of the things that come into play. But there will be a program. I'm just not sure exactly what it'll look like after that December 31st date. But there will continue to be a program, yes.
Okay, we have another question. Why were multifamily housing a consideration in land use?
I can take this one. Multifamily houses often, or residents of multifamily housing, often face disproportionate barriers to installing charging station at home. They often have to rely on a public network. So, you know, a single family detached homeowner can install it in the garage versus multifamily housing. They might have to rely on the tenant or the landlord or the building owner to install it. So that was part of our analysis to try and one, reach the largest amount of people, and two, try and reach those residents that might face larger barriers to EV adoption.
Okay, we have another question. Have you considered installing covered charging stations and stations that can accommodate an EV pulling a trailer?
Hey, Marge, Jim is going to be logging back on, but I can take that question for right now. So we will consider, we've talked about potentially having covered stations, especially if we utilize solar panels for EV charging stations. We haven't talked about coverage for trailers, but I'm sure it's something we can take into consideration.
I can add to that a little bit. That is something that can and has been looked at, especially when it comes to the fast charging projects that we have had coming in from some of our funding sources or grant funds that we've had in past times. And so, some of those have been funded to allow for those vehicles who are pulling a trailer or a camper or what have you. And in the American Access Board recently, and they're the ones who set all of like the ADA compliances and how to deal with measurements, and this should be this far away from this particular area. There are requirements on how to deal with parking spaces that have pull-through charging stations for ADA compliancy. So there is definitely guidances out there and stuff for businesses to take that into consideration when they're installing charging.
Okay, we have another question. And what will be the proportion of level 2 versus fast chargers? I would think that the majority should be fast chargers, since L2 requires you to plug and then sit.
I can take this one in that I'd imagine it's sort of unknown at this time. It's really dependent on the specific sites. Level 2 might be more advantageous in specific areas, and DC fast charging might be more advantageous in specific sites. So at this stage, it's really high level and hasn't been delved into that level of detail yet. Susan, was there anything you were going to add?
Yeah, yes and no. I think we're trying to get an answer, right, to where do we need to focus our time by doing this planning effort. What we know that because the NEVI funding that Jim talked about, part of the requirement up front is that we spend that on these DC fast charging stations. We need to understand what the landscape of the land looks like, because we do need to make sure that people who live in housing without garages or off-street parking also have the opportunity to access at-home charging. 80 to 90% of charging that is done by electric vehicle owners right now is done at home. And we want to make sure everybody can access that. So stay tuned for an answer to that question.
Okay, it looks like we've got a number of different questions about apartments, apartment buildings, and building codes. We also have a question here about incentives for homeowner associations and management organizations. Will there be incentives for these housing types?
I'll take this one. So we actually currently have an incentive program that incentivizes multifamily dwellings, and it is for those who are owning of the property. So the HOAs, the management is not the individual tenants or the owners of the condos. It has to be the person who or the company who's owning the actual property. So we do have our rebate program, and we actually give a little bit of a higher percentage for those communities, just because we do know that some of those can be some financial barriers. There are also going to be a lot of line items in the bipartisan infrastructure law funding opportunities, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, that will assist this. It's a very well known that many people live over about 50% on the last I knew of people who live in these types of communities, and charging at home is a barrier for them because they don't have charging at the apartment complexes or condos or what have you, for a variety of reasons. And sometimes the buildings are just not adequate enough to support the infrastructure. So there's piloting projects, there's researching and going out and trying to find ways to provide charging at these communities without actually having to do a bunch of upgrading and whatnot. So, we certainly want to we take that into consideration, but we also have to take into consideration that not everybody has a driveway, not everybody has a garage. A lot of people live and have street parking. And so we have to look at those two, those as well, not just those with garages and driveways.
Okay, we have another question relating to Tesla chargers and our DC fast charge locations throughout the state. The person wants to know, what are we considering as DC fast chargers? I have not seen these available in reality using the PlugShare app. Most DC fast chargers are Tesla chargers that can't be used unless you own a Tesla. Is there a response to that question about what we're considering?
I can take that one. It's data directly from the federal government's alternative fuel database. So it does include Teslas, non-Teslas, anything 50 kW or larger. We do know that there's some maintenance issues with those, but those are also included based on when we pulled the data.
Okay, we have another question regarding maintenance and repair turnarounds. What do those turnarounds look like for existing charging stations? And does the workforce exist to repair and maintain new stations statewide?
I could take this one. So the maintenance and repair turnaround. So most of the new stations, they've got warranties and generally don't go down for several years unless they have to be upgraded or something goes wrong, and then the station owner can work with the manufacturer to have those upgraded. But it usually is in terms of level 2 anyway, it is on the owner of the station itself. So with the business, the multifamily dwelling property owner or the homeowner, if they have a charging station at their house. As it relates to workforce, that as Joe was talking about earlier, having to do with the NEVI funding and additional federal funding, workforce development is a huge component of this. And so we have got a lot of conversations with a lot of different people around the state and trying to work out workforce development, training, at the student level, at the community college level, at the blue collar training level, for people to be able to fix the EVs, install the charging stations, fix the charging stations. So it is coming. We're still very new in all of this and trying to figure out how this all works and keeping stations up and running. But workforce development is definitely a hot topic right now for us.
Okay, and then for these stations, when you align with contractors, will there be a stipulation or stipulations to keep them in good repair and to deliver the kilowatt hours needed?
So there are a lot of questions about this type of repair in the chat. And I know some of that is driven by some frustration with EV drivers right now with some stations that are down. I can tell you that in a recent request for grant opportunity that we had to incentivize private businesses to install DC fast chargers, as a component of that, there are some expectations about uptime when being funded and some stipulations for that. And I expect that will continue. So too, when we are going to be looking at providing grant funding in the future from whatever sources for charging stations, there will be a preference for charging stations that are near amenities. I saw a couple of questions about that as well in the chat. We know that if you're going to be stopping to charge, you would like maybe a place you can go in and use the restroom or buy a soda or a coffee or something. And so that is a major component of thinking about the specific site, but not the general sites, right? Because this plan is going to show us how many we might need in which zip code, rather than where to specifically place chargers within that specific zip code or geographic area. But yeah, we want to make sure that amenities are available to folks who are sitting for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes recharging their vehicle. I saw another question in there about how this incorporates the climate action plan and the climate action plan's goal to reduce vehicle miles traveled by 10% by 2030. And while this plan helps us move forward in the climate action plan's goal of stimulating the transition to electric vehicles, the electric vehicles themselves are not going to reduce vehicle miles traveled. You know, the vast majority of our emissions do come from the emissions from vehicles. Electrifying those vehicles or utilizing other zero emission vehicle technologies is one of the fastest ways that we can use to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, is another initiative that we know we do need to work on, and land use planning and transit and working from home, and all of those are a component of that. So the vehicle electrification is one component of the Delaware Climate Action Plan, but there are many other strategies that we can deploy to reduce vehicle miles traveled. And for anybody who is looking for the I think anybody who is looking for the website where you can email comments, it has been dropped into the webinar chat. And if you can't find that, it's evplan@delaware.gov. evplan@delaware.gov.
And then Susan, there's also a link in the virtual meeting room if you came in that way to click on the box in English and Spanish to provide comments.
Correct. That's the online comment form.
There is also a lot of questions about the fast charging situation here in the state. So if I could take the opportunity to address some of that. So the state, as I mentioned, does not own fast charging stations. The fast charging stations that are out there are all privately owned, whether it's through Tesla or Royal Farms or Wawa with the Electrify America station. So with the federal funding under the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Funding, the NEVI plan, the guidance under that is we are expected to install fast charging stations along our alternative fuel corridors, which is routes 13, 113, 1, and I-95 within 50 miles from each other and within 1 mile off of the exit. From the end of the exit has to be off of the exit to the highway. Because Delaware being so small, we took that a step further and we decided to make goal locations every 25 miles. And so each site, each location or charging station area would have multiple charging stations. It has to have at least 4 DC fast charging stations at 150 kilowatt minimum each. And it's not power shared, that is 150 minimum each station. That does not mean that there's only going to be 4 stations there. That could mean that there'd be 8 stations there. It just depends on the entity. It depends on the funding. It depends on what the location is. If it makes sense and if it really supports the goals for the state. The fast charging stations that are at the Royal Farms that are not working right now, that is a ChargePoint Royal Farms relationship. And those stations are slated to be upgraded with that national the NEVI funding. So we are aware, and those are going to be upgraded with that funding when that funding opportunity does come. We are waiting for the federal government, the highways and the Department of Energy to come up with what they call a final rule. And in that final rule is going to tell us what the expectations are, the minimum maintenance requirements, the minimum signage requirements, the minimum, what they have to look like. It's going to have pricing. It has to have kilowatt per hour. All of this has to be available when a driver pulls up to those stations. They need to know how much they have to pay, what the kilowatt per hour charge is, and all of that information. So, you know, there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of supply chain problems. There's a lot of, every state is all trying to do the same thing. And there's only so many companies who actually produce DC fast charging stations. So trying to keep up with that, along with the other supply chain issues, is challenging. So we are very aware. We're trying to work on it as best that we can. But you know, we have the funding and we're ready to rock with it as soon as we get that final rule from the federal government to kind of tell us exactly what needs to happen and how those stations have to be managed and maintained. So I hope that answers a lot of questions and some concerns about that.
Marge, are there any other questions in the chat that are
unique that we haven't answered? Not that I
minutes left?
immediately see. The plan, just for everybody to know this, is we will be putting all the questions and the answers that were provided in a frequently asked questions page on the on DelDOT's website for the EV plan. So in case something hasn't been answered, it'll be answered there.
And as Jim mentioned, the recording for this will be posted on the EV webpage. And then we'll also be doing a frequently asked question by compiling all of your questions and maybe some of the questions that we didn't get to either in this session or the next session. So we will try to make sure that we address any questions you may have. Also, on the webpage, there is some contact information. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask via email or call DelDOT or DNREC to discuss further, that contact information is available there as well. So in the interest of getting prepared for our next session in 3 minutes, we want to thank you for joining us today. We're really happy with with your participation, and obviously the public input is extremely important as we create this EV infrastructure plan. So thank you and have a good evening.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our discussion on the EV infrastructure plan. We'll give another minute or so for folks to join who are joining, so we'll be with you in about a minute or so. Thank you. Okay, it looks like it's slowing down the number of people who are joining us, so we'll go ahead and get started. So good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Pappas. I'm the Director of Transportation Resilience and Sustainability at the Delaware Department of Transportation. We want to thank you for joining us this evening. We have a presentation to give you tonight to kind of give you an update on where we are in the state of Delaware with our EV implementation plan. We're very happy and excited to be joined by an esteemed group that has been working on this plan, and you'll be hearing from several panel members or key team members here in the next hour as we give this presentation. Next slide, please. So this is our first public meeting. Tonight's meeting will be recorded and it will be uploaded to the state of Delaware's website for EV infrastructure. So if you can't join us for the full hour, or if you have to step out, or if you have others that may be interested in this and weren't able to join, it will be available on our website for you to take a look at. Next slide, please. So I want to start off with some introductions of the team, and again, the members of the team that you'll be hearing from this evening. So next slide, please. So from DelDOT, you have myself again, Jim Pappas. I'm the director, and Stephanie Johnson is our assistant director for transportation resilience and sustainability. And our partners and working collaboratively and with is partners at DNREC and the consulting firm AECOM. So I'll kick it off to Susan from DNREC, if she can introduce the team.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks to our great friends at DelDOT for collaborating with us on this effort. My name is Susan Love. I am the administrator of the Climate and Sustainability Program in the Division of Climate, Coastal, and Energy. But more importantly, I have with me Brianne Pryson, who is a planner with who specializes in climate and transportation issues. I can't see her on my screen, but I think she's there somewhere. Brianne?
I'm here. Yep. Yep, clean transportation planner with a division of climate, coastal, and energy.
So over to AECOM.
Sorry, thanks, Susan. This is Joe Hofstein with AECOM. We're happy to be working with DelDOT and DNREC on developing this plan. I'm joined by Marge Quinn and Brendan Connolly.
Okay, great. And like I said, this is the team that has been working on this plan and the team that you will be hearing from this evening and moving forward in the future. So really excited to share the work that's been done to this point. And again, DelDOT appreciates all the input of DNREC and AECOM to get us to this point. Next slide, please. So this evening, here's kind of the agenda of what you're going to be seeing and hearing for the next hour. So talk about our expectations, the background of how did we get to this point, what is an EV infrastructure plan, talk about the goals that we have moving forward, give you a snapshot of the existing infrastructure, because we obviously have some infrastructure in place already. AECOM's going to go over, Brendan's going to go over an analysis of future locations, and then talk about next steps and how you as a community can stay involved going forward, which again, that's really important to us. And then we'll end with questions and answers. And Marge will kind of let you know how you can be involved both this evening and moving forward.
So what are our meeting expectations for tonight? Well, as Jim has mentioned, this is our first public meeting on the EV infrastructure plan, and there will be more to follow. We're here tonight to kick off the planning process with members of the public and to begin public engagement, start having conversations about EV charging needs. So how can you provide comments or ask questions or provide input into the plan? Well, for tonight, please use the Zoom's Q&A function. It's down at the bottom. Anytime during the presentation, so while we're going through the slides or even afterwards when we have a question and answer period, just type in your comment or ask a question. Anytime you can fill out a comment form that's located in the project's virtual room that can be accessed at the plan's website as well. And anytime you can send an email to the plan, and that's evplan@delaware.gov. Next slide. In addition to working with the public, DelDOT and DNREC are also working with an advisory group that is providing advice and counsel on the plan's development process. We're working with a group of over 20 different organizations are represented on this advisory group, ranging from transportation organizations to electric utilities, as well as community organizations and environmental groups. And over to Brianne now.
I think I would learn my lesson after 2 years of being on webinar calls. I come off of mute. So we're going to kick this off by kind of giving a little bit of a background of why we're doing what we're doing and why an EV infrastructure, and just kind of give some basics on electric vehicles. Assuming some folks on the call may not have all of the ins and outs of the different technologies. So next slide, please. So in November 2021, the Delaware's Climate Action Plan was released, and that really is what kind of kicked us all off on really moving forward with our EV adoption. We have been at it for some time, but our Climate Action Plan was really what our document was that kind of really pushed us forward. And so the Climate Action Plan is intended to guide the state's efforts in minimizing greenhouse gas emissions and maximizing our resiliency to climate change impacts. So the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is from the transportation sector, particularly from light duty passenger vehicles. And so over the last several decades with our transportation system, we've certainly learned to rely on our cars to get us from point A to point B. But the emissions coming from those tailpipes contain a suite of pollutants that are not only the largest contributor to our climate change effects, but has also had a profound negative impact on our air quality and human health, particularly communities that have been disproportionately impacted that are near pollution sources like highways and ports and power plants. So, and areas with more traffic are going to see the greater effects, which makes sense, right? So higher numbers of traffic are going to have higher numbers of affected people. And there tends to be higher hospitalization rates from our younger and our older populations. And children can miss more school from illnesses, from asthma, from being sick a lot. And so because of this, they can fall behind academically. And there's also a correlation with lower graduation rates in these particular areas as well. So in the state's Climate Action Plan, one strategy to minimize greenhouse gas emissions is to transition to electric or zero emission vehicles and more efficient transportation systems. But in order to transition to zero emission vehicles, such as electric vehicles, which is what our technology is right now, there needs to be the infrastructure in place that will help with that transition. Next slide, please. So the availability of charging stations is a critical factor in electric vehicle adoption, and having a comprehensive charging network, including home and public charging, ensures that EVs are as convenient as a conventional vehicles are, and it will increase EV driver confidence. So to help guide this transition, we needed to kind of get an understanding of the landscape and where EV chargings need to go. You know, and it's not specific locations; it's within zip codes, within areas. And Brendan will get into that a little bit later. But the EV charging infrastructure plan will also inform us on how to expand that charging network. It'll help us strengthen the consumer adoption of EVs and also help ensure that the grid is stable, and it will stimulate the economy with job creation, workforce development, and training. So the plan is intended to be a living document, and it will be upgraded or updated as the landscape changes, which is pretty often. So we're going to be looking at this plan pretty regularly to ensure that we are on track with our goals. Next slide, please. So another strategy in our climate action plan is to have 17,000 new EV sales each year by 2030. And so this was the number that had come out of the modeling that was done for the climate action plan to achieve our emission reduction goals. And so one of those ways to achieve that is by adopting the Advanced Clean Cars 2 vehicle emission standards, which will require 100% of new vehicle sales to be zero emission vehicles by 2035. Several manufacturers have already declared that they will be all electric over the next 15 to 20 years, with more manufacturers making that declaration as we get further into our transition. Next slide, please. So I don't want to assume that everyone on the call here today knows the difference between the technologies, so I'll kind of just quickly go over the basics. So a full battery electric vehicle is just that. It is all electric. There's no gas, there's no engine, there's no transmission, there's no thousands of moving parts to get to brake. So they have low maintenance costs. They're super fun to drive. They save money on fuel. They're zippy little things, and they certainly help fight against climate change. And then we've got our hybrid. So we've got our plug-in version, and then we've got our conventional or our regular hybrid. So both of those do run on gas with a high amount of fuel efficiency, but the plug-in versions do have larger batteries and are plugged into a wall like an EV. And the vehicle can run solely on electric before it'll kick over to gas once it runs out of that range. And it is recharged, like I said, through the wall or either through regenerative braking, which will give them a little bit of that range back as they get around and driving around town. With a conventional hybrid, the vehicle kind of chooses when the electric motor is used, which is generally when idling or driving at super low speeds. It does not plug into a wall, but they do have regenerative braking, so it kind of can recharge that battery a little bit as it's braking around town. I am gonna put a link in the chat that does give a pretty comprehensive list of all of the plug-in hybrid and battery electric vehicles available on the market today. It certainly doesn't include the Bentleys of the world, but it's going to include the Fords and the Teslas and the like. But that list gives prices, it gives current federal tax credits, it gives safety and charging rates and different levels and anything else that you didn't think that you would probably need to know about an EV. It's going to be on that list for you. So we'll drop that in the chat. Next slide, please. So in terms of how to charge an EV, there are 3 levels. You've got level 2, level 1, 2, and DC fast charging, or level 3, though it's not really often referred to that as that. It usually is referred to as fast charging. Level 1 is on your typical 110 volt household outlet. It's a good option for smaller batteries like plug-in hybrids, but for full battery electric vehicles with larger batteries, it's not the best. It's not the most practical option, as it can take days to charge a fully depleted battery. Level 2 chargers are on a 208 or 240 volt circuit. It's kind of like having another appliance at your home. This is a more practical option for at home or work charging. And so for those who can charge at home or at work, they can charge while they're over at night or during their work day and come out and kind of have a full tank of gas, if you will, a fuel tank, tank of fuel, if you want to go about their business. So no more cold mornings, standing at the gas station, pumping gas, freezing. That they've got charge right there in the morning. So for those who do need a quick charge for traveling, or they forgot to charge at home or at work, DC fast charging stations are a much quicker option to get the charge that they need. And we'll talk a little bit later in the call today about the fast charging here in the state. So next slide, please. So what is the state's role in EV infrastructure? So we provide funding through various programs. We've had grant programs for fast charging stations. We've got our DNREC's EV charging station rebate program for level 2 stations. Our role is also to help establish contracting mechanisms and identify areas where policies and regulations may need to be changed or updated or even created in order to accelerate EV adoption. So though there are a few state-owned level 2 stations here, installed, kind of trickled throughout the state at state-owned locations. In general, The state of Delaware does not plan on owning and operating any DC fast charging stations here in the state, and the ones that are out there are privately owned and operated. We are simply just going to be the funding mechanisms for private owners to install stations on their own property. So I'm going to go ahead and punt this back over to Joe from AECom, who's going to talk about the plan itself.
Thanks, Bree, for that great background information. As Bree said, I'm now going to begin to discuss what is in our EV infrastructure plan. So what is an EV infrastructure plan? The goal of the EV infrastructure plan is to identify the future EV charging needs of Delaware. That's not the specific location of where an EV charger is, but more the general area, such as the zip codes, where we want to put concentration effort to encourage the building and establishing of EV chargers across the state. We want to make sure that the plan takes special focus is paid to the disadvantaged communities, the rural areas, and then also residents of multi-unit dwellings. Those are all groups that can easily be left behind and have a harder time getting easy access to charging stations. So we want to make sure the plan takes specific effort to address those communities. We want to make sure we incorporate the following items in the plan: assembling data on existing conditions, preparing the future forecast. What type of charging demand do we expect? What type of EV vehicle adoptions do we expect in the future? And then we want to make sure we're engaging in the stakeholder and the public, which we're doing now. We want to continue to do with the plan and into the future with the plan. We want to make recommendations for the EV infrastructure priority areas to make sure that we're focusing on the right areas and maximizing the dollar values. So the plan outline, these are the major sections that we're looking to have included in the plan, and we welcome public feedback and comment on these. I'll spend a little time going through these areas. So the plan, vision, and goals, I'm going to be discussing in the next couple of slides, which we really would like additional feedback on. And then the public involvement and stakeholder engagement. The other chapters are going to be existing and future condition analysis. That's going to be for both the Delaware EV market analysis and the Delaware EV charging demand analysis. And then also the plan is going to report the findings that we discover as part of the plan and our background research that Brendan's going to be talking about. The other key component of the plan is deploying the infrastructure so it's built out for the future. We want to make sure we look at the policy barriers that may be in place and try to remove any of those barriers so that the EV deployment can happen as easily as possible. We also want to look at workforce development needs. We want to make sure the plan takes into account the workforce that's existing out there, and then also the new workforce coming in. We want to make sure they have access to the training and education to be able to install these EV chargers and maintain them in the future. We also want to look at future funding sources that are out there. There's many different types of funding sources, and we want to make sure we're taking full advantage of those funding sources. And then the last component is resiliency and sustainability. We want to make sure that the EV chargers are operational and functioning throughout their lifespan out there, and that people driving throughout the state have easy access to the chargers and know that they're reliable and will be there to use. So the draft plan vision. Is enabling current and future users of electric vehicles to confidently travel in and across Delaware for work, education, recreation, and exploration. Confidently traveling is a key component of this. As many people have experienced the frustration of going to an EV charger that doesn't work. We want to make sure that when this is laid out across the state, the user of the EV can confidently go to the EV charging station and know that it's going to be working and reliable and that they can use it. Please give any feedback or suggestions on this plan vision. Next, I want to get into the different plan goal areas that are as part of the plan. And once again, we appreciate any feedback or suggestions to these goal areas. The first goal is equity. We want to ensure that rural, underserved, and disadvantaged communities, including suppliers and contractors, are engaged and realize the plan benefit. We want to make sure that the benefit of the EVs is reaching everyone, and that everyone has equal access to EV chargers and that no one is left behind. And then we also want to make sure that the contractors and suppliers are also not left behind for the larger ones. We also want to look at reliability, develop a reliable, convenient, affordable, and equitable EV infrastructure network in Delaware. As I mentioned before, we want to make sure that when you go up to that EV charger, you know you expect it to be working and that it will work. Connections. We want to connect the Delawareans and travelers in Delaware to EV chargers to support the electric transportation future. And then education. We want to make sure we develop outreach material on electric vehicle, good charging habits, station locations, station usage, equipment capabilities, and how to provide feedback on the network, and use social media apps to do that. And then the last goal is evaluation. We want to develop a framework to collect data and evaluate the plan over time and refine and update as mentioned. Bree mentioned this earlier. We want to make sure that this plan is a living document and keeps up with the changing times and the adaptation rate of the vehicles. So we'll continue to go back and monitor the plan and make sure it's still meeting the goals and the needs of the Delaware users. I'm now going to hand it over to Brendan Connolly to discuss existing conditions.
Thanks, Joe. We can go on to the next slide. So first, we're going to talk about the existing charging infrastructure in the state. Based on data from the Alternative Fuel Center, there are 25 installed DC fast charger locations that host a total of 97 ports. Ports are similar to a connector that actually plugs into your vehicle. So typically a DC fast charger location, even a level 2 location, contains numerous ports there. On the level 2 front, there are 108 charging locations for a total of 229 ports, and you can see where those charging locations are shown in the map on the left. We'll be providing a close-up on each county in the following slides, but you'll notice some overall trends of charging stations. They're predominantly along the major highway corridors in the state and in the northern part of the state. From the map, you'll also notice that there are gap areas in the network, which is what we're trying to fill as part of this initiative. And these are often rural, disadvantaged areas of the state as well. Next slide. So for each of the county maps that we're providing, we do provide a little bit more detail on the charger itself. So we know which stations are Tesla stations, and then the capacity levels at the DC fast chargers. We'll discuss why these details are added in the coming slide, but they're a little bit more granular of what we showed in the previous slide. Looking closer at Newcastle County, there is a concentration of chargers predominantly in New York and Wilmington along I-59, and some of the southern areas of the county lack infrastructure. In Kent County, chargers are predominantly along US 31 and Delaware 1, right by Dover, with kind of the boundaries on the east and the west side, areas that we can fill in gaps in the future. And then finally, Sussex County continues the trend of being really along the major highway corridors and arteries of the state, but there's also numerous chargers sited along the beach towns on the southeast side. Next slide. And so the federal government has designated specific routes that are to be prioritized for installing EV charging infrastructure. And these are known as alternative fuel corridors, or AFCs. And you can see the 5 routes that are designated AFCs in Delaware. They're I-95, I-295, Delaware 1, US 13, and US 113. And there's a substantial amount of funding to support DC fast chargers along these routes through the NEVI program, which is currently in progress. There's very specific criteria on those charging stations in order to qualify, which is why we added some of those details in on the previous slide. But really the purpose of this project is to focus on developing a cohesive network throughout the state and not focus on those corridors, but work in parallel with that initiative as well. Next slide, please. And so now we'll be moving on to some of our modeling results and analysis conducted to assess charging demand in the state and identifying priority areas for future charging. I note that these are preliminary results at this time, and we're really looking for feedback on our methodology to really refine to meet the needs of the community. We'll be presenting our final results during the next community workshop based on any updates that we hear today. Next slide. So to assess charging demand throughout the future, we developed 4 growth scenarios of EVs in the state. The scenarios are intended to really show an order of magnitude on the number of EVs possible through different various scenarios that vary cost, model availability of EVs, the available charging infrastructure, and associated policies to really drive EV adoption throughout 2040. Again, these are intended to reflect different outcomes and potential planning scenarios. And as things change throughout 2040 due to supply chain concerns, different environment regulations such as policies that are going on, or the price of gas, they might be reflected through these different scenarios. So based on these results, you can see that it's projected up to 32% of all passenger vehicles in the state could be zero emission by 2035. And I would say that really the main takeaway that we want to flag here is that EVs are expected to grow in the future significantly, even under some of these low growth scenarios, and really require an enhanced charging network and policies to support the demand moving forward. This becomes even more important for the ambitious Clean Cars 2 initiative, which would aim to target 100% zero emission sales by 2035. Next slide. We'll now dive into our methodology for identifying priority areas for future charging that would be needed to support this adoption. And at this level, we're really targeted on zip code level, not really identifying specific sites at this point, but just determining where charging is needed and where it should go. So we first identify areas using this data layer analysis that we'll provide more details on in the coming slides. And then from here, we can provide a recommended charger type. And then, as we're doing today, we really want to validate some of our preliminary findings with the public and share and hear your feedback. Next slide. So to identify priority areas, we looked at 4 different modules, and this is reflecting of what Joe and Brianne mentioned are the goals and the aim of the initiative that we talked about earlier. So each module has a different criteria associated with it, and we're pulling that data from publicly available sources. So those include EV charging network, which is where we look at the existing level 2 and DC fast charging infrastructure in the state, traffic, average annual daily traffic along some of the major routes. The next module is early EV adopters, which we look at specific demographics that have been correlated to early EV adoption, such as income, car ownership, and education. The third module, land use, we want to focus on multifamily housing and where population density is. And then finally, the fourth module is equity, where we look at data layers such as unemployment, social vulnerability, pollution exposure and asthma rates, housing burden, and the access to public transportation. And we'll dive into the importance and why we looked at each of these modules as we're sharing our preliminary findings on the next slide. So I would note with each of the modules and criteria, we're able to create a weighting or assign a weighting for those values based on input from stakeholders like yourself. And so you'll see on the right-hand side, here we're showing our preliminary results and the associated weighting that we have. The check mark is the weighting that we've assigned for the module, and then the gray boxes selected are the weighting that we've applied to each of the different criteria. And so the 4 following slides are the results from each of these modules, and the thought is that combining all of these different modules together will give us our total result to identify where these focus areas should be. So for early EV adopters, we wanted to consider where charging infrastructure is needed and where it would be utilized in the near term by early EV adopters. Adoption is expected in the northern part of the state, as you can see by that dark green tint. So those represent areas where they should be prioritized based on this current module. And then you'll see on the east side of the state, along the beach area, that there's another more early EV adoption expected as well. And it's unsurprising that these areas, have these rates that we're forecasting due to That's also where existing charging infrastructure is located. Next slide, please. So the second module, this is for the existing EV charging infrastructure. And there's really a higher priority set on filling gaps in the network along highly trafficked routes. And you'll see scores are higher where chargers are missing and along some of the main highway routes that are on the state, shown as darker green. Next slide, please. The third module for the land use, we wanted to site chargers in population centers and where multifamily housing exists, as these are often residents that face larger barriers to installing an EV charging station at their home and really rely on a public charging network. We also want to kind of reach as many potential end users in the future as possible. And so you'll see a lot of the highly populated areas are shown in a darker tint. And then the final module is the equity. We really thought that this is a high priority, and kind of a focus of this plan is to site charging in underserved areas that often lack charging infrastructure for EVs, but they also face the kind of the worst disproportional impacts from pollution. So areas that face all of those are more vulnerable are shown in a higher priority green tint. And then finally, kind of bringing it all together. So those are the preliminary results for each of the 4 modules. And the thought is we'll bring the totals from each of those into a kind of a total layer that will be used in the future to create a heat map of where charging should go by the zip code level. At this stage, we're really looking for feedback on the process, how we weighted some of those modules and criteria. And then the intent is that we would share the final results during the next meeting. I'll pass it over to Jim to close us off now.
Right, great. Thank you, Brendan. So thank you so much for the presentations, everyone. So now we want to hear from you. So as Marge mentioned, you can drop any questions that you may have in the Q&A session. So for us as a team moving forward, our steps moving forward will be to review the feedback that we receive, both during tonight's session and through the opportunity that you have through that website to provide some commentary. As you saw, there's a lot of work that has been done to this point, but there's still work to be done. So continual analysis of the information that we have, and then we'll share all this information at our next meeting that we tentatively have scheduled for later on in the wintertime. Next slide, please. So again, how to stay involved. So there is a website that has been created. And again, this is where like tonight's recording will be uploaded as well. There's a location there for you to send comments either tonight or after tonight, after you think about it, or maybe go back and watch the recording again, or any questions that may come up. And again, continual engagement and involvement as we move forward in these public meetings. Next one. And so at this point, again, we've kind of concluded our part of the presentation. So Marge, if there's any Q&A that we have, we'll be happy to answer the questions.
Yes, we've got a couple of come through. The first is, will the plan include encouraging utilities such as Delmarva Power to offer incentives such as lower electric costs for charging during the evening or other hours? I believe other states offer these incentives.
So I guess I'll start, and if DNREC, if you have any further, please feel free. So demand charge is something that, again, was a discussion that we and DNREC and the University of Delaware and others had earlier today. So we understand the demand charge. We have engaged with the utility companies through this process, and will continue to stay engaged with them. So, some of that is beyond all of our controls, but we have, started that engagement. They know what's forthcoming with this plan. And so we want to work collaboratively together moving forward.
I think you did a good job answering that, Jim. I appreciate that. But the other thing I'll point out, he's learned so much, folks, so much. The other thing I'll point out is that this plan does set the baseline and gives us the information that we will need to figure out what the next steps are in this transition. And so sure in the future, I think this plan will give utilities perhaps some information that they may need to start making their own plans moving forward. I muted myself halfway. Again, you'd think I'd know how to use Zoom by now.
Okay, so we have another question. What is the status of federal and state standards for standardized plugs and standardized methods to pay, much like Easy Pass is becoming the de facto standard for toll payment?
So within the NEVI plan, and Bree, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe there was a standardization, or there's move towards standardization with the various electric vehicle or manufacturers of electric vehicles moving forward for a standardized plug.
I don't know about the plug. So yes, yes, for both. There is for the payment side of things, they have the requirement for an open network. It's a long fancy word, but basically an open network. So if it's a charge point station, and somebody has a card for, I don't know, Electrify America, they can use their card. It's interchangeable. Or if ChargePoint decides to no longer manage that station, then another charging station company can come in and kind of take it over without having to completely change the network. So there is a requirement for an open network. And any RFPs that we put out for competitive funding will certainly require that as well. The plug, yes. So there is the combined charging plug for, speaking on fast charging, then there's CHAdeMO, and then there's Tesla. So Tesla is working on standardizing their plugs worldwide. I'm not quite sure where he is on that yet. But Tesla owners also have adapters that they can get either through level 2, or that they have a fast charging adapter that they can use to bring at non-Tesla charging stations. It doesn't quite work the other way around. And then the other outlier, if you will, the CHAdeMO port is a Nissan Mitsubishi plug, but they have actually changed that to go over to CCS. So they've already started to transition into that. So some of our stations, we still will require the CHAdeMO plug. So for those who are driving the older Nissan Leafs or the Mitsubishi Outlander plug-in hybrids, they still will have charging opportunities to plug their vehicles in fast charging stations.
Okay, we have another question. This might be best for Brendan to answer. What is the plan for weighing these modules? The person says maybe this was mentioned already, but that they may have missed it.
Yep. So those preliminary results that we provided in a couple slides up, those were based on weightings that were previously assigned, and that was performed in collaboration with other stakeholders, DNREC and DelDOT. And then we're presenting it here today to get feedback on it. So if there's any sort of concerns or questions about the ranking that we previously assigned, happy to hear them.
Okay, we have another question, and there's a couple of these that are related to renewable sources for generating electricity. Are there any plans for the state of Delaware to pursue generating its electricity from more renewable sources?
So we know that an electric vehicle, the total net emissions for an electric vehicle will get cleaner each year as the grid that they plug into gets cleaner each year. No, it was last year. Last year, the state of Delaware updated what's known as its renewable portfolio standard to 40% renewables by 2035. I know that there is some talk about taking another run at that in Legislative Hall in the next few years. I'm not sure that's going to happen this coming year. There's also several additional efforts having to do with electricity grid and electricity planning. that will also weigh in on those issues. So this is but one plan being done. We're moving forward with several plans, working together collaboratively moving forward for this transition.
So we have another question here. Can a municipality apply for the funding, or does it have to be private? And is the funding intended to be a matching grant?
So I'll start the response, and Susan, if you want to correct me. So the funding that the state of Delaware has received through the NEVI program, it's funding that DelDOT has received. There's a state match, but that's that funding is available. So we envision that the formula funding that we're receiving, which is a non-grant, so it's non-competitive, we kind of have that money in our bank account. We have funding available to move forward with the deployment of the EVs.
So I'd also like to highlight, that the purpose of doing this plan is to tell us and you, people who have given up your rainy Monday night to be here with us, what is the most important place, or where is the most important place? What is the most important type of infrastructure to focus on? And once we know that, we can go after whatever funding is necessary to do that. Or it might not be funding. It might be policy changes. It might just be education and outreach to apartment complex owners, et cetera. So, we've talked some about the NEVI program, which is a federally funded program. We also have additional programs that have been in existence here in the state since 2015 using other state funds. And there are many, there's utility programs, there's many other federal opportunities. So there's a lot of ways to fund this transition or make policy decisions around this transition. The important part is this plan telling us where we need to focus our efforts. Of course, we're going to go after the money we know is there to do the things, but sometimes, that money may not always be aligned with the thing that we've all defined together as the most important. And when we do that, we'll look for funding so that we can do what we want to do.
Okay, we have another question here. Is there any funding available to support upgrades to the grid to support transitioning to EVs?
Not through some of the funding sources that we've talked about tonight, but there are funding sources out there. In fact, the bipartisan infrastructure bill through the federal government and the Inflation Reduction Act both have significant pots of funding for transmission and grid upgrades. Part of the goal of doing this plan is going to show us and our partners, including the utilities, where we're going to see deployment of electric vehicles first and what kind of charging they might need. Once we have that, then we can look at any kind of grid issues in cooperation with the utilities. And then, look to see what kinds of upgrades may be necessary, if they are necessary at all.
Yeah, I'll just add that the presentations, the information we've been provided to this point, because this question has come up nationally. The kind of the way that it's been explained to us is basically from the transformers to the actual chargers is what this money and this program is focused on. Anything beyond that, again, like Susan mentioned, there are other programs that are available, but the NEVI specific is not kind of going, that far into the grid.
Okay, we have a question here that hasn't been asked previously. Will there be an education program that gets rolled out to local governments?
Bree, this is your question.
So we have been doing a webinar series this past year with our local governments, having to do with charging, installing charging in their communities for the public use, transitioning their fleets to electric vehicles and in charging stations for their fleets. We've talked about other funding opportunities. And then our last one, which is due in December, we'll talk about building codes and ordinances and policies and regulations and things that some of our towns and municipalities can be thinking about whether it has to do with parking or installing charging stations in residential homes, right of way, situations for people who do not have driveways and garages. How are we going to deal with street parking and things like that? So there's talks, there has been reports, there's been studies recently on this very topic, and so we're working on it.
And I'll add that our local governments are really interested in this, and many have taken steps already to provide charging in their downtown areas. I'm going to mention some, and maybe Bree can add more. We know that the towns of Newcastle, Newark, Milford,
Smyrna, Seaford, Lewis, Bethany Beach.
Oh yeah, see, she's so much better at this than me.
Yeah, so
And-
they're coming. They're small amounts, but they're working on it. So
Okay, we had questions relating to location maintenance in our other session, but we haven't had one tonight for this session. Does the EV plan incorporate standard commitments for location maintenance?
Yes, there are reporting requirements that are in the NEVI plan. And when we put out an RFP to commission and deploy these, that will be contract language that will be in there, that will be included.
Okay, we have another question. How can we encourage other EV companies to take over these charging stations, formerly ChargePoint?
Bree, do you think that question is trying to address some of the charge point stations that were once
Royal Farms, yeah.
at Royal Farms?
So I think that this is a good opportunity for me to address the fast charging situation, kind of like I did the last call for those who might have come onto the second call again. So, we're pretty aware, we're very aware of the lack of fast charging opportunities here in the state. I will say that we do not own those stations. Those are privately owned between the Royal Farms or Wawa or Tesla or whatever those situations are. We don't own those, so we do not have control over whether or not they're up online. We can encourage, we can call just like everyone else, but we cannot make them come up online. So the state has had a couple of opportunities through other grant funding opportunities to install fast charging here in the state. And then with the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Plan, the NEVI plan that we've been talking about here, there's some criteria with that. But the criteria is that fast charging stations need to be installed along right now at first our alternative fuel corridors. So that's going to be Route 1, Route 13, 113, and I-95. We are expected to fund stations, or they're expected to have stations installed every 50 miles and within 1 mile off of the exit to the highway. Being that Delaware is super small, that won't take us very long. So we took it a step further and we set a goal of every 25 miles. And so that's going to be Newark, Middletown, Smyrna, Milford, Selbyville, Laurel, Georgetown, all of our major ports. And we're really going to be covering all of the little major arteries of the state. Once the Department of Transportation, U.S. Department of Transportation, not DelDOT, U.S. Department of Transportation has deemed that our alt fuel corridors have been built out, we will then be able to use those additional funds for other community charging, and we can start getting in on the secondary and tertiary areas. So we are working on the fast charging opportunities. Within that, we have the funds, as Jim said, but we are waiting on what they call a final rule. And so the U.S. Department of Transportation and Department of Energy has to put out a final rule that's really going to direct us on what we put in our RFP. We have a requirement for maintenance. We have a requirement for reporting. There has to be at least 4 DC fast charging stations at a minimum of 150 kilowatt per hour, each station not power shared. That doesn't mean that there can't be more than 4 with more juice coming into those stations, but that is at a minimum. So with those stations, the stations that are at the Royal Farms that are so graciously adorned with black trash bags that I've seen recently, those stations are they're down. We know this. ChargePoint does not support that software any longer, or those machines any longer. So they are slated to be upgraded or to be funded to be upgraded when we do have those NEVI funds available. So once we get that final rule out that tells us exactly how to maintain the stations, what reporting requirements there are, how to deal with payments and compliancy having to do with the American Disabilities Act, making sure that we're putting, just like if you were to go to a gas station, you can see how much it is per gallon. All of that information needs to be on the stations as well. So there's a lot to it. There are very few DC fast charging station companies that build these stations. There's a lot of names that get put on them, but there are actually very few manufacturers that manufacture DC fast charging stations. Not every site is a one size fits all. Some sites have the infrastructure to support the fast charging stations. Some of them need full, huge transformer upgrades, which then exacerbates the supply chain issue. So we're very much aware of the lack of fast charging here in the state, along with all the other charging that we certainly need. But I see some of the questions that we've got in our chat. Will there be chargers installed at these particular locations? We are only the funding mechanism. And so if these gas stations want to come in, if these businesses come in and they go after that funding, certainly they're welcome to do so. But we as the state will not be going into those particular areas and plopping in stations. We don't own that property. We can't do that. So I hope that answers some things on our fast charging situation here in the state.
And I've seen a couple questions about, will chargers be located, right, as you've addressed. And then I just saw one come in about whether the focus is on DC fast charging or level 2 charging. And I think it's, again, important to point out that this plan is going to help us answer the question of where should we prioritize charging opportunities and what kind of charging do we need to focus on to make sure that EV charging is accessible to all. And so I lost the question. Oh, there it went. And so the plan's not going to focus necessarily on DC fast charging or level 2 charging, but it's going to tell us where and what locations we might need to focus one or the other. We've talked a lot about DC fast charging because there's a new funding opportunity, the NEVI funding opportunity to do DC fast charging in the short term. But that's not all we're focusing on here. That's just the most exciting new opportunity to spend money to do the infrastructure upgrades. There's a question about the data maps. And maybe that's for Brendan. Some folks are interested in seeing the maps, maybe being able to zoom in on them a little bit finer. Can you address that?
Yep, we're happy to share those. Perhaps we can figure out a way to post those on the website just so it's able for download.
They're available right now in the virtual room, and then they will be available after tonight. The entire slideshow will be available as a PDF that can be enlarged and zoomed in on DelDOT's website.
And then before we wrap up, I know that there were some folks who had trouble accessing the Zoom earlier, and there is a question about how to access this information. Can we make sure to repeat how folks can get access to this webinar and the information that we've presented tonight?
Joe,
Maybe-
could you put up the slide that talks about how to stay involved, please?
Sure will do.
And as we've mentioned a number of times, so both sessions, both the 5 o'clock and the 6 o'clock sessions have been recorded. So we will be uploading those to the website. So give us maybe 72 hours. And they should be, because our IT folks are on and everything's being recorded and will be uploaded. Just takes a little bit of time to do that. So, tonight's Monday, say by the end of this week, if not beginning of next week, tonight's both sessions should be uploaded. So again, like Susan mentioned, we apologize. There might have been some challenges getting in to begin with, but everything that was discussed tonight will be uploaded. The presentations are obviously the same at both sessions, but some of the questions were a little bit different at each session. Here in the second session, we obviously had the opportunity to kind of pull some of those questions from the first session. But, if you would like to, again, go back and see either one of the recordings and again, share it with friends, feel free. And there's also, the ability to email the site and, that's monitored as well. So if there were specific questions you may have had that weren't addressed, or if you think of something else afterwards, please feel free to reach out and, we will respond. So anything we missed, Marge, in the last minute or so that we have?
No, just that we will be, posting a frequently asked questions document on the website as well, and that may help participants as well. But no, it looks like we have got through the questions that came in tonight, so we have a few minutes to close. Okay.
Well, so I'll start by just thanking all of you for your engagement this evening, both tonight and obviously going forward. We've hopefully, as you can tell, we've assembled a really great team here that hopefully answered all of your questions, or at least kind of got you thinking about some of the things that are, moving forward. We know we're not done. We know there's still more work to do, but we're very excited for the state of Delaware to be able to have this program and use the funding that we're going to be receiving in the most effective and efficient way possible. And not sure if we specifically said this, but the process that we will go through is, and Bree mentioned this, is we're waiting for some final guidance from the federal government. Once we get that, and again, all states are in the same boat. So it's not just Delaware that's out here on an island. We're involved in a number of groups, both locally and nationally, where we're sharing information with other states, best practices and things like that. So everybody's waiting for this final rulemaking. That point, some type of a contracting mechanism. Different states are kind of doing it different way based upon their bid laws. We'll be putting out, some type of an RFP, we envision. Then, next spring or summer, we will hopefully be going to construction and starting the deployment of the actual infrastructure and the building of the charging station. So that's kind of our general time frame. But again, we can't really do anything till we get some little bit more information from the federal government. We've been assured that they're working on that. And again, all states are kind of in the same boat in that respect, waiting for that information. So that's the work that this team has to do going forward. We all know that. We're very excited to kind of keep this ball rolling and deploy this infrastructure. So so with that, we are going to close it out. And again, I certainly appreciate the team here that was represented. So thank you so much to DNREC and the AECOM team. And thank you for joining us this evening. And again, any questions that you have or anything you'd like, please feel free to go to that website, and that will hopefully answer your questions, but there's also the ability to reach out to us. So with that, thank you so much and have a great rest of your evening.